On today's Live Open Daily, we're talking about storytelling in virtual reality gaming. I'm gonna give you my top 10 storylines ever created in VR. I'm gonna preface this by saying that these are not the best 10 games in VR, just their storylines were the best out of what I've played, and go into my general kind of issues with storytelling in VR, why I think there are some easy tropes that a lot of games do, and some things I hope to see change down the line. I'm your host, Live Open Mike, and I've played well over 200 VR games at this point. Close to 100 of those were single player adventures with storylines included. I grew up playing RPGs and straightforward action adventure games, a lot of single player games. I didn't play a lot of multiplayer when I was a kid, so this is right up my alley. And when I got into VR, I was looking for stories and good games like this because I think virtual reality has a chance to tell you a story and immerse you in the story in a way that traditional flat screen just simply cannot. I should point out that I'm going to pretty liberally talk about all the stories in this game, so there are going to be massive spoilers. If you want to keep yourself from being spoiled, I understand, and I'll catch you on the next episode. Number 10 is Into the Radius. I don't think ITR gets as much credit as it deserves for the amount of storytelling that it tells here and the denseness of the story it gives. Into the Radius is a dystopian survival shooter where you play as Explorer 61 in this, it's kind of hard to describe, but like an alternate dimension, a Twilight Zone-esque area called the Radius. The origins of this is that sometime in the 1980s, and this changed a couple of times between the early access version of the game and what it is now. At first, it was a bunch of miners who discovered a crater that became the Radius. Pretty sure I had that right. And in the current version of the game, a meteor struck this town of Pechorsk. I hope I said that right. Pechorsk in Russia. And they either killed everyone, either turned them into these crystalline fragile shards, or into these black blobs that just straight up attack you. As I said before, you're playing as Explorer 61, which applies that you are the 61st Explorer throughout this area. As you start running missions in the Radius and you start venturing deeper into and closer to the center of it where this gigantic castle is, a few things happen. Number one, you start finding artifacts from other previous explorers, and through them you can also find letters from them and other lore that kind of explains their time in the Radius, and you start to piece this game together. You also meet among those other shards that I mentioned earlier of other humans who live there. There's this white shard that you meet of a girl called Katya. Every time you encounter her, and whenever you touch one of these shards, whether it's her or someone else, assuming they're not trying to kill you, they shatter into pieces and you get a voiceover of what their previous life was. Katya is different because she starts to explain her plight and basically that you're the only person that can save her and rescue her and restore her to her previous life. Over the course of the game, you encounter Katya in almost every single mission you go through. In addition to the lore that you get from the other explorers, you find that through letters, you find that through some of their artifacts, and you learn more and more about what happened in this area before you got there. It's never made exactly clear when you enter the Radius versus when the actual incident that created the Radius happened, but it's implied to be around somewhere around 15 years. That doesn't really vibe with the guns that you encounter in the game, so I think it's closer to 20 or 25, but again, the game leaves that slightly ambiguous. I think a lot of VR games go for the dystopian route because frankly, it gives you an excuse for you to stay alone. And that's one of my problems that I have with VR games, and you'll hear this as I go through some of the other games on this list. You spend a lot of your time alone, and if you have any interaction with someone else, and this game is guilty of it as well, it's either through some kind of note, or it's through a disembodied voice, either like another character that's on comms. There are tons and tons, like dozens of VR games that do this, or through some other device, basically someone who's not human, either as another creature, an animal, or a device like the floating drone and Hubris. But in general, you interact with very few other people, and I think developers do that because frankly it's hard, and it's hard to make them look realistic. There's a couple of games on this list that kind of fall into that trap, and it actually kind of hurt the reception when you go into like the reviews and the critical response. What's different about Into the Radius from dozens and dozens of other VR games where you spend all this time by yourself is this game really sells you on the concept that you are by yourself. And the more that you interact with Katya throughout the game, the closer you get to her, and the more you feel like you actually want to help her, which basically sets you up at the end of the game for you have to make a horrible choice to basically choose to save her or do something else. And the game does a really good job of setting up the stakes such that that's actually a very hard decision, which also means there are multiple endings to the game, and I'm hoping that Into the Radius 2, which should be out very soon, sometime within the next year or so, we'll find out whatever choice you made is canon and then move forward from there. And throughout the course of the game, you're made to question everything you know about the Radius because you actually don't have any memories about what happened before. You know very little, if anything at all, about the previous explorers who were there, other than you know that a lot of them died because you were told that before you went into the Radius. But for the most part, you were just sent there to run missions, run research, and do this stuff all by yourself. And the more you play the game, the more doubt starts to creep into your head about whether or not this is actually real, whether or not you're hallucinating, whether or not this is some illusion or some mad scientist test. There's a whole bunch of different ways that the game kind of seeds and plants out in your head. So when it comes at the end of the game where you have to make that choice, again, you're unsure of it. And it's something I wish more dystopian future games, because again, there's a lot of these games, I wish they put more of an effort into making you actually feel alone in the game, as opposed to making a dystopian game, because it's a cheap way to not have you interact with any other humans, so the game developers don't have to make any other humans. But Into the Radius, fantastic story. Number 9 is Ruins Magus. This called itself a JRPG. It's not, we'll get to that in a minute. It's really an anime style dungeon crawler, and then while they get the look and feel of a JRPG correct, there's a lot of like tropes of it, like a party management system, proper progression, leveling skill trees that it just doesn't hit. You play as a rookie magi, one of the orders of the Ruins Magus, in a town called Grand Amnes. There's a whole bunch of tunnels and dungeons underneath Grand Amnes, and it's your job to clear them out of any like bandits or monsters so they can be safely explored and mined for resources. You get a companion in this game. Unlike Katya and Into the Radius, your companion is someone you actually meet, even though when you're in a dungeon, she's represented by a hologram from a little robot that she built, instead of her being there with you in person, other than the very beginning and the very ending of the game. Along the way, you meet warriors from other lands, you meet another magi who is in love with a royal, and there's a really nice LGBTQ story in there, because one, they come from different classes, one's a magi, one's a royal. Second, they're both female, and it's not really directly said, but it's heavily implied that their relationship is being frowned upon because of that very fact. It's a really affecting love story, and it takes place right in the middle of the game. There's a story about you basically battling and befriending a group of bandits who kind of give you this begrudging respect. There's a bunch of little mini stories dotted throughout the game as you level up and become a more powerful magi and increase your bond to your companion. Then come the end of the game, you learn about all the exposition, and this is where it goes full JRPG, because there is a bunch of exposition towards the end of this game. And this is something that VR tends to play with but doesn't really go all full bore with, because frankly it can be boring to stand there and just watch a cutscene play out in front of you. Now Ruins Magus and a couple of other games in this list get away with it by moving you forward through the story, by actually having like stuff move around you and creating an inner 3D space, as opposed to like a flat panel, which would be absolutely terrible. But for the most part, you do spend quite a bit of time towards the end of the game just standing and watching a scene play out in front of you, as opposed to being actively involved. For a lot of people, this may not be your jam. You prefer something that's very simple, so you get back to the action. But to me, that's inherently limiting in storytelling, because you're going to get the simplest characters, the simplest plots, and it's not going to be something that's really going to leave you fulfilled like a really good, deep, long game you would see on flat screen would. Not necessarily a straight JRPG, but there are tons of like action RPGs and other adventure games that have big, sprawling lore that you really can't get in VR, because most developers are basically kind of scared to make you stand there and just go through a bunch of lore and exposition by itself, so they tend to keep the story simple. Ruins Magus doesn't really do it, and I think it's better for it. Like I said, it does take its cues from traditional JRPGs, and it wears that on its sleeve. I think it's a fantastic story. Number 8, Half-Life Alyx. I can already see my comments blowing up because I put this game this low, so just hear me out. Half-Life Alyx takes place between Half-Life 1 and Half-Life 2. You play as Alyx Vance. I think she's 19 years old when that game starts, the daughter of Eli Vance, who's a character in the mainline Half-Life series. The game, frankly, is fantastic. It's one of the best VR games ever made. Where I think it lets it down is that this game really heavily relies on you having played another Half-Life game. Not necessarily in the beginning, but from the second you meet a Vertigon, which if you don't know what a Vertigon is, because you've never played Half-Life, that doesn't really land as well as it probably should have. And then towards the end of the game, when you start talking to other characters, when you meet Eli Vance, when you start hearing names like Gordon Freeman and the G-Man, those names mean absolutely nothing to you if you've never played a Half-Life game before, and the game does, frankly, a piss poor job of explaining who those characters are and why they're important and why you're meant to care about them. If you're a Half-Life fan, then that's fine. You're probably freaked out when you went through, oh my god, Gordon Freeman, oh my god, the G-Man. But if you don't have a connection to that universe, then maybe you're left a little lost and wondering why this is actually important. Gordon Freeman is the main protagonist of the original Half-Life games. So again, if you played them before, that's a big deal to you. If you've not played them before, maybe not so much. From about the middle part of the game, where you realize that there's a train carrying a prisoner that you believe might be Gordon Freeman at one point, the game starts to ramp up towards a pretty crazy conclusion that, again, really only truly lands for you if you are a Half-Life fan. If you're not a Half-Life fan, it still kind of lands for you, but it really doesn't have the impact that I think the developers were going for, because there was a lot of presumed prior knowledge from the player going into this, and I think that was a mistake from Valve. I'm going to spoil the ending here, so if you want to skip ahead about a minute to save yourself, Half-Life Alyx is like 4 years old at this point, but if you still haven't played it, just skip ahead about a minute. So at the end of the game, you free what you thought was going to be Gordon Freeman, but it's actually the G-Man. And the G-Man says, hey, thank you for freeing me. You've kind of earned my respect. I will grant you any wish you want. Alyx at first asks to send the Combine away from Earth. G-Man says, no, that's not going to work for my employees, but I can do you one better. I can stop your father from dying. What actually happened is that in Half-Life 2 Episode 2, which came out a few years before Alyx did, Eli Vance actually dies. What the G-Man is showing you is a vision of that future and gives Alyx the chance to change that by saving her father. So that happens, you manage to save Eli, but then the G-Man double crosses you, and then Gordon Freeman, who has been held in stasis since the first Half-Life game, actually gets replaced by Alyx. So at the very end of the game, number one, you're Gordon Freeman, which if you're a Half-Life fan, you freak out over, that's amazing. But then you realize that Eli is still alive, but the G-Man has taken Alyx, and that kind of fundamentally changes what happened in Half-Life 2 in episodes 1 and 2. It's a wild ending, but if you're not a Half-Life fan, you're kind of like, you're upset that you as the character Alyx got tricked and now you're trapped in some sort of stasis, which is a cliffhanger that I fear may never be solved because I don't really know if Valve really wants to continue with Half-Life. Half-Life 2 Episode 3 was already canceled once. But again, not being a Half-Life fan, you care about Alyx's plight, but you don't really care about Eli, you don't really care about Gordon, you don't really care about the G-Man, you really don't know who Gordon and the G-Man are, and that really lets the story down. It's still a fantastically presented story. Half-Life Alyx is an amazing game, the story's pretty good, but they could have done a better job of onboarding you with the previous knowledge of the games, like some other games on this list we'll talk about. Number 7, Journey to Foundation. So remember when I said that I'm not really rating these games as objective games, but just as stories? This game is a perfect example of that. This game is based off of the works of Isaac Asimov, and to try to give you a quick summary of it, some point in the distant past before this game begins, there's this philosopher and mathematician named Harry Seldon who predicted that the Galactic Federation is going to collapse at some point very, very soon, and that's going to lead to a period of something like 30,000 years of just despair throughout the universe. Seldon puts together a plan that mitigates some of that 30,000 years of the Dark Ages basically down to just 1,000 years before humanity can recover, but he's basically labeled a heretic and a lunatic by the Galactic Federation, actually I think it's Galactic Empire, Galactic Empire, for his thought process, and he's basically exiled to a place that he later changed into the titular Foundation. You play as Ward, an investigator in the Galactic Empire who has these powers called Mentalics that allows you to read the feelings and sometimes the thoughts of people that you encounter. And this is where the game really takes off in the story piece and lets a lot of VR gamers down because of how this game is actually structured. This game is all about conversations and the relationships that you form with the characters. Almost every choice of dialogue you make in this game actually shapes the form of conversation that you're having with that person. Since you are an investigator, this means that if you're interrogating someone, you can answer the wrong way and then basically turn them off and you can start the interrogation all over again. There's actually an interrogation at the very beginning of the game that if you answer the right way or say the right things, you can get through in about 2 minutes. But if you say the wrong things, it took me, I think, almost 15 minutes to get through it because I kept responding with the wrong answers. You were put on the trail of a daughter of a missing high-ranking member of the Empire named Astoria, who has actually defected to Harry Seldon's philosophy, and actually instead of herself being kidnapped, she basically snuck out and is forming this group that is trying to carry out Seldon's philosophy and stop these Dark Ages from being 30,000 years. From this point forward, as Ward, almost every choice you make matters because there are multiple characters that are put in peril, and your decision about maybe something that happened earlier in the game or something that happens in that moment determines whether that character lives or dies. Going back to that interrogation I talked about, at the end of that interrogation, after you get the information you need, you can choose to either let that person go and they can live out their life on an exiled planet, or just airlock them out into space and basically kill them. That choice actually informs what another character says to you roughly 30 minutes later. There's another great example of this where after you infiltrate the Astoria's group because you're acting as a double agent, there is a period of the game where you can kind of slow the game down and have a bunch of different, almost mindless conversations with other people in her crew. There's one specific character that if you do not have a conversation with said character, when that character is put in peril later, whether or not that character lives or dies depends on whether or not you chose to have a conversation with them and you learn something about them that saves their life. If that doesn't happen, that character dies. The first time I played the game, because I was live streaming it on my Twitch and YouTube channels, I kind of skipped over that and didn't have a whole lot of ancillary conversations with NPCs, so that character ended up dying. On my second playthrough, I talked to every single character I possibly could, and multiple characters who died in my first playthrough lived in the second playthrough. There are also 2 alternate endings to this game, because at the end of the game, you're presented with a choice about basically which side you fall on. You ultimately have to pick a side. and that side determines what ending of the game you get. This game, again, is all about choices, and more importantly, choices having consequences. There are a lot of VR games out there that do not do a good job of making your choices have consequences. They're just very clear about leading you on a very linear path, and it doesn't matter what you really do, as long as you don't die, you'll get to the end of the game. This game gives you choices, not so much in the choose your own adventure because the game doesn't really branch all that much, but what happens to the characters totally depends on everything you said starting from the very beginning of the game and the very first conversation you have. In Journey to Foundation, your choices matter, and that's not something I could say for a lot of VR games. I thought the story was really well presented, even if the game itself has its own issues, and I talked about that when I did my live stream. I'll probably do another podcast because I need to review the PC VR version of that game. But the story, top notch, is one of the best you'll experience in VR. Number 6, Saints and Sinners Chapter 2 Retribution. I am not going to sit here and tell you that Saints and Sinners 2 is a better game than the first game. The first game is one of the best VR games ever made. I will always die on that hill. That is a fantastic game, but the story's not great. The story is essentially a fetch quest. So you meet a character named Casey over radio who sends you on these fetch quests to go like grab this part to fix this piece of device and then do this. There's another branch of the story where you encounter another character called May. May herself is on the run from a group of one of the two warring factions in New Orleans where the story is set. There's two groups one called the Reclaimed and one called the Tower. May is on the run from the Tower for a bunch of reasons that we'll talk about when we get to episode 2 here. At the end of the first game, you're presented with a choice on how you want to handle the final fates of May and Casey. The reason this is important is because in Chapter 2, there's a titular character called the Axeman. The Axeman is in all the promotional material for the game, and it turns out the Axeman has a very personal tie to you, the tourist, which is the character you play as. The Axeman is actually the husband of May, which means the Axeman, his name is Garrick, has a very, very personal axe to grind, pun intended, with you. The reason I think Chapter 2 has a much better story than the first game is because Chapter 2 puts you, the tourist, at the center of all the actions. In the first game, you're kind of like an outsider coming into this, and you kind of get slipped into this war between the two factions. But for the most part, until pretty much the very end of the game where you have to make a choice, nothing you do really matters. You can kill one character or kill another character, really doesn't sway one way or the other. In Chapter 2, you are the central character around every single thing, and every single event in the game revolves around you, which means you as the player feel like you have autonomy in the story. And it's not just moving you along a linear path to get you to a predetermined conclusion. No, you can choose to go one way and that'll influence how one character thinks about you. You can choose to kill a character or not kill a character. You can choose to influence one character to kill another character. There's a whole bunch of different twists and turns and ways that this can go. And ultimately, it leads you to the very top of the tower where you have to make a choice as to whether you want to save New Orleans or doom it to death. In case you haven't figured out, I appreciate a story where it feels like what I say actually matters, what I do actually matters, and it doesn't feel like the developers are just springing me along to like predetermined conclusion and that's all they're really doing. There's nothing really wrong with that, but I think the power of VR comes in being able to give your character and you as the player choice in the way that you really can if you're sitting there holding a controller, because you feel like you're more invested in the story. This game does a really good job of that, way better than the first game does, even though, I'm not gonna lie, Chapter 2 is riddled with bugs. It is a buggy, addled mess. It's not a fantastic playing experience, and frankly, the only reason I finished the game is because the story I thought was that good. Number 5 is Moss Book 2, and unlike Saints and Sinners Chapter 2, this sequel, Moss Book 2, is infinitely better than its predecessor. And unlike Half-Life Alyx, it does a perfect job of onboarding you into what this game is. Moss Book 2 is a semi-third person. It's actually, you're playing the first person, but you're controlling the third person character, a little mouse named Quill. And this game is essentially a hack and slash platformer. You, the player, are a character called the Reader who, through a fairy tale being narrated to you, explore Quill's world of Moss and invest into Quill's story. Quill herself in the first game was on a mission to save her uncle from the evil Arcane, this evil metal machine empire or something or other that are basically setting out to destroy the world. You save your uncle at the end of the first game and kill this gigantic mechanical snake called Sarfog in a really, really cool sequence. In the second game, which picks up right where the first game left off, you, the Reader, and Quill are on a quest to collect all these pieces of this mystical force called glass from all these different parts of Moss. Using this glass, you believe you can destroy the Arcane forever, but there are all these different races warning you that that's a bad idea. Being incredibly headstrong, Quill decides that she's going to do this no matter what, so she starts to make this happen, and in the course of that, unfortunately, her uncle, who you spent the entire first game trying to save, dies. It is a heartbreaking death, especially if you played the first game, but even if you hadn't, the way the game is scored, the way it presents itself, everything that it lays out makes you feel that moment, and then right after that happens, your connection to Quill, you as the reader, your connection to Quill severs, and then you spend the next hour and a half to 2 hours playing with a totally different character named Sahima. You eventually make your way back to Quill and then proceed to the end of the game. I think it's indicative of the storytelling that happens in VR and a vast majority of these games where the story is kind of paper thin and the story is really designed to get you from one action piece to the next, and it's just, there's not really much of a story there. This game is built around the story because the entire crux of the game is how connected you as the reader feel towards Quill. If you don't have a connection with Quill, this game's not going to land for you. You probably don't have a heart. And it all feels like, even though this game really takes place from basically a third-person perspective, you feel like you're playing more as Quill than you are as the reader. You feel involved in Quill's world and you feel immersed in her story because of how well the game is presented. It's a fantastic story. It's one of the best stories I've ever seen in VR. And frankly, if you're a bit sensitive, it could make you cry. Number 4 is Asgard's Wrath 2, and as much as I love Asgard's Wrath 1, it was my favorite VR game until this game came out. When I replayed it before I played the second game and I had to download that 145 gigabyte file, I started to realize the weaknesses the game has. In this game, you play as a god who can possess the bodies of mortals, imbuing them with some sort of supernatural power. Basically, it's an excuse for the characters that have shield or more life, but each character in the game has a vendetta against a god, and it's your job as the sentient god character to lead them to their conclusion, which will create this gemstone that is needed by your mentor, Loki. Surprise, surprise, because it is Loki, at the end of the first game, Loki betrays you and traps you in this hell space that he created to look like a bar. At the beginning of the second game, you escape from the bar and realize that to find Loki and basically get your revenge, you have to travel to and help another pantheon of gods to direct you to where Loki's location is. This takes you to Egypt. Once you're in Egypt, you go through basically the same cycle. You encounter a number of characters, 4 to be exact, that all have a different vendetta against gods for different reasons. And through helping them realize and finish their stories, you collect another set of mystical stones that helps you locate Loki. The strength of this game over the first game is that, number 1, the characters you play as feel a lot more realized. In the first game, the first character you play as is a character named Ingrid. Ingrid herself has a fantastic story, but the other three, Frodi, Reese, and Sakan, really don't. You don't really feel connected to what their plight is, primarily because they're not the best people in the world. They're all kind of jackasses. Ingrid is a badass, and that's why you love her. In Asgard's Wrath 2, there were a couple of things that were different. Number 1, the pantheon of Egyptian gods that you meet, the good ones, the ones you befriend, basically create this hub area. There's a hub area in the first game too, but you don't meet any of these characters, whether it be your armor or your merchant or anyone else outside of this fake tavern that Loki has created for you. In the second game, most of the people that become your vendors and your friends are characters you have to discover within the world themselves. They all have their own separate stories and their own reasons for being there, whether that's Castor and Polydeuces, Ptah, Thoth. They all have different reasons why they're there to help you, and you have to earn their friendship and help. In general, that gives you a deeper connection to these characters other than just, hey, I'm gonna go to Ptah when I need more armor. No, there's a specific reason why Ptah, number 1, wasn't making armor before you met him, and then he gives you a side quest to collect a bunch of collectibles throughout the desert that will give you a special trinket and a power up throughout the game if you manage to find all 50 of those. The second thing is the companions. There's only 5 companions in Asgard's Wrath 2 as opposed to, I think there were 8 in Asgard's Wrath 1. Each of these characters seems to have a very distinct personality. Sabera the Panther is the first one you meet, and she is snarky as all hell. Everything from, no, you're gonna come give me scritches, which basically give me a high five, to you're gonna admire me, you're gonna love me, I'm awesome and you don't realize how awesome I am. There's Vigo, who is just a lunkhead of a warthog. If you ever met like a stereotypical dumb jock in high school, that's who Vigo is. There's Marette, who's my favorite character in the whole game. She's a hippo who just really doesn't give a damn what anyone thinks about her. Scratching herself, slapping her belly, just feels like a drinking buddy. She's a lot of fun. And then there are the 4 characters that you actually possess. Unlike the first game where really Ingrid was the only one that had a story that I really felt personally connected to, in this one, all 4 characters have a story that you connect to. Abraxas is the first character you play as. He's on the quest to kill a character called Sekhmet, a god, because Sekhmet killed his father. A very simple revenge story, but over the course of the 10 to 20 hours you play as Abraxas, he starts to learn that gods aren't all bastards, and even though he really wanted revenge, he starts to realize that revenge may not be the best way to move his life forward, because the revenge is the only thing that's been fueling him for a very long time. The second character, Cyrene, is a water nymph who wants to stop an evil god called Sobek from destroying a swamp on the base of the Nile River that she calls her home. There are 2 other characters. I'm not going to get into all 4 of their stories, but basically they all have 4 pretty involved stories. Really, the third character, Alvilda, is the only one who has a bit of a thinner story than the other 3 characters, but especially the 4th one has a pretty deep story that, if you're paying attention and you're listening to everything that character says, is pretty damn tragic. Beyond being one of the biggest action RPGs you can ever play in VR, that is not a flat to modded VR game like a Resident Evil 4 or Resident Evil 8 or something like that. in terms of a natively built for VR game. And I get that people don't maybe want to invest 50 to 100 hours into a VR game in one single story. I get that, but if you do, you're going to find a really well told story that you're not going to get pretty much anywhere else in VR. Number 3 is Another Fisherman's Tale. It's kind of hard to describe this game, but it's essentially a straightforward fantasy adventure game. You play as a fisherman that in this game can detach all parts of your body because you're actually made out of wood. You can actually detach your hand and move it around the arena that you're in to solve puzzles, pull levers, get keys, things like that. It's a really creatively laid out puzzle game, but the story itself is deeply affecting. In the story, you're controlling 2 different characters. One is the titular fisherman who is actually relaying a full story to his daughter about what ends up being, even though he says it's him trying to find this fantastical paradise called Libertalia, he's actually telling the story of how him and his mother got together and how his daughter came to be. All this being told in media res, meaning it happened in the past already, because you were doing this through flashbacks, and in the present day, you are playing as his daughter, now full grown up. The fisherman named Bob is now dead, and you're going through and cleaning out his stuff and reliving all of the stories that he told you and learning things about him that you never knew and your mother, his wife, never told you. It's a deeply affecting story that has a couple of twists and turns and kind of pulls at it, especially if you have a very close relationship with your parents, or spoiler alert, 3, 2, 1. If you've ever dealt with anyone in your family who has dementia, it's a pretty deeply affecting story. At the end, it crescendos to a pretty emotional moment that if you are a parent yourself, or if you have lost your parents already in your life like I have, it's something that's pretty deeply affecting. It's not a particularly long game, it's about 3.5 hours long, but it's terrific. Number 2, Dyschronia Chronos Alternate. This is a game that is basically a visual novel. There's not a whole lot of action in this game, so it is very much an acquired taste. But like Asgard's Wrath 2, like Rune's Mages, if you invest in this, you're going to get a lot out of it. This is another dystopian future game, but you're not spending this entire game by yourself alone. The city that you're actually in is just encased in this dome, because outside the dome is basically hot death. Inside of the city, most of the humans in this are basically put into this hive mind like collective. Because they're all in this hive mind, they all experience and see the same things, which means that crime really doesn't exist because every single citizen can see what you're doing. Well, that doesn't really happen because at the very beginning of the game, there is a doctor who helped raise you who actually ends up murdered. Your job as Hal is to investigate his murder and figure out what happened. This dovetails into a massive story about time travel, alternate realities, about death, about life, about grief, and again, here's that word again, about choice. There are 3 different endings in this game, and actually if you get certain things wrong, you can actually backtrack through time and try to set them right. But at the end of the game, faced with basically the end of all of humanity, you as Hal have to make a choice about which way you're going to go. You'll see a common theme in all these games I'm describing, and that's that most of these games have other characters you interact with. Part of the things that limits VR storytelling is that you don't really interact with anyone else. You're just listening to a disembodied voice in your head, which is essentially telling you, hey, go here and do this, go here and do this, go here and do this. So you feel like you're kind of like a marionette. You're like a puppet on a string, just being led towards this conclusion, and nothing you do really matters. So whether or not you enjoy that game depends on how good the gameplay is, and a lot of VR games really fall into that category where they live and die on their gameplay, where the story isn't really enough to be compelling to move you forward. Every game on this list is very different. At multiple points throughout all of these stories, just like any good story, whether that's television, movies, books, whatever, there are multiple inciting events that kind of spur you on and say, hey, whoa, okay. And either you, one, have to make a choice there, or there's something that you feel like you kind of have to know what's going on. You got to go to the next chapter, you got to turn the next page, you got to watch the next episode, you can't wait to see the next movie if it ends on the cliffhanger. Good VR games can do that as well. Dyschronia is broken up into 3 episodes. The first 2 episodes do actually end with cliffhangers, and I can tell you at the end of episode 1, I could not wait to play episode 2, and the same thing with episode 2 into episode 3. That's the mark of good storytelling, and that it wasn't a cheap cliffhanger that didn't feel earned. It is something that was the natural conclusion for the story that you were being told at that exact point, but now you have to wait for the next episode. I played them all in a row, and I would have been irate if I had to wait for these episodes to come out separately because I played the first episode. Again, Dyschronia is not a game for everyone. You spend more time in conversations, reading dialogue, and just interacting with people as opposed to physically doing a whole lot. There's no real action in this game, and it's very much a visual novel. But because it is a novel and is being told in the VR medium, it's probably the best example of what this is, other than number 1 we'll talk about in a minute. But in terms of pure story, not as a game, pure story, Dyschronia is top tier, and you should check it out if you're looking for a good story to play in VR. Number 1 is Lone Echo 1. I can't say enough for how good and how engrossing this story is. This game is a modern day classic. There's a reason it's called one of the best VR games ever. Lone Echo 2 honestly felt like more just a continuation of this. It felt more like chapter 2 as opposed to being its own separate thing. Very similar to like Asgard's Wrath 2 or Moss Book 2 or another Fisherman's Tale, where they're telling a whole separate story. Lone Echo 2 really just feels like the continuation of part 1, which if you're looking for the continuation, that's fine, but it doesn't really stand on its own 2 feet. In the first Lone Echo game, you were playing as an android called Jack. As Jack, you're serving under a human named Olivia Rose, who becomes your companion pretty much throughout the course of the game. There's an anomaly that messes up your ship and knocks a bunch of stuff offline, and it's up to you to scour the bowels of the ship and go outside the ship and basically do everything you have to do to repair it. Organic like biomass matter that is threatening to basically take over the entire ship because it's absorbing every single thing it touches. And after this anomaly happens, Olivia disappears. You're then left with an AI companion named Apollo, who basically tells you one, that Olivia is no longer alive, even though that turns out to not be true. And together you have to start to piece the ship back together, reunite with Olivia, and figure out what the heck's going on and get everything running properly again. I made that sound more simple than it is, and in truth it's not really a deep story. What makes this game great is the relationship you forge with Olivia throughout the course of the game. When Olivia is put in peril, you absolutely feel it because you spend so much time with her. Unlike most other games where you're listening to someone else over comms and they're just directing you on what to do, you're having entire real conversations with Olivia, you're bonding with her, your dialogue choices open up more of her past and her connection to you and really deepens that connection. So again, when she's put in peril, you feel it, and at the end of the game where you're both in peril and she's expressing all this worry for you, you actually feel that that's earned. There's a lot of really heavy character work that Radiant Dawn does in the first roughly like 2 or 3 hours of this game to make it feel like when the last 2 hours are happening, you actually feel like you're in danger, and more importantly, you care that Olivia's in danger. That's a really tricky thing to do, and it's done absolutely masterfully. To me, Lone Echo is a masterclass in storytelling, and it's like a prime example of what VR can do for storytelling in a way that a lot of the games just kind of let down. So those are my top 10. If you go back through the entire list, you'll kind of see some common themes throughout both. Number one, choice is actually mattering, as opposed to you, the player, just being told pretty much go here and do this, go here and do this, go here and do this, without any real reason of why you should be doing that. Why do I as the character care about doing these things? Why should I invest my time in this? You're actually being made in these stories to care about what you're supposed to be doing, and that can propel you forward even through some games like, for instance, Dyschronia, where there's not a whole lot of action going on. It's your connection to the character and the characters around you, more of that in a second, that makes you want to continue playing. And then there's other characters. I cannot overstate how tired I am of playing VR games where I am alone for the entire game, and all I hear is like some voice on the radio saying, oh, now you have to find this key and then open this door, and then I'll open up this thing, then you press this on the computer, and da 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 da. And there's a lot of games like that. That doesn't mean those games are necessarily bad. I think Genotype's a fine game. I think Resist is a fine game. Those are two just random examples of games where you don't really meet another human character, but the gameplay is still fun and that carries you all the way through it. But that means that the story itself is not super involved in either one of those games. They keep it simple to keep the action moving. And frankly, I think having played over 200 games now, this is something that I hope really changes in the future. And you don't need a budget of $100 million to be able to do this. A lot of games that I named on this list, really all of them with the exception of Half-Life Alyx and Asgard's Wrath 2, were made by relatively small studios that don't have massive budgets to be able to crank out incredibly large, dense games. Lone Echo 1 was funded by Oculus Studios, but Radiant Dawn was not a massive team before, and that was before Meta even gutted them. That was just never a large team to begin with. You could tell a decent story if you take the time to put care into how the characters are presented, to give you other characters to care about, and a story that you care about where your choices matter. I don't think enough VR games do that. That's a wrap for this episode. This is more of an opinion piece, and I hope you understand kind of where I'm coming from on this. And since I gave a list, and I gave a pretty definitive list, including putting Alyx pretty low on it, let me know what you think. Tell me I'm crazy. Let me know down in the comments, and I'll talk to you tomorrow.